The carriage smelled of fear. Rose had been sitting inside it for 3 days, and by now she knew that smell well. It had soaked into the old velvet cushions, into the wool of her traveling cloak, into the very skin of her hands that hadn't stopped trembling since the morning her father had called her into his study and told her what her sister had done. She pressed her back against the cold wooden panel and watched the forest pass through the small, foggy window. The trees here were enormous, ancient pines that rose like black columns against a sky the color of ash. There was no sunlight beneath their canopy, just shadow and cold, and the sound of hooves on frozen earth. "You are the only one who can fix this," her father had said, not looking at her. He had never been good at looking at her. Rose was 23 years old, the second daughter of Lord Edmund Vance, and she had spent most of her life being invisible in a house that revolved entirely around her elder sister, Cecilia. Cecilia, who was radiant and sharp and effortlessly magnetic. Cecilia, who had been promised informal alliance to the Lycan king's court. A political arrangement built over 2 years of careful negotiation between the human noble houses and the wolf territories of the north. Cecilia, who had run off with a merchant's son 3 weeks before the ceremony. Rose pulled her cloak tighter. The wool was rough against her neck, practical rather than beautiful, much like everything she owned. She was not plain in the way people sometimes said to be kind. She was plain in the way that meant she had simply never been seen. Brown hair that did not catch light the way Cecilia's gold did. Eyes the color of winter moss. Not striking, not unusual. A face that people forgot after looking at it. Her father had packed her bags before she had agreed to go. The king sent a formal summons, he had said. He expects a Vance daughter. He does not yet know which one will arrive. And that silence, that deliberate, cowardly silence, had told Rose everything she needed to know about how this was going to end. The carriage jolted hard over a root, and she grabbed the window frame to steady herself. Through the foggy glass, she caught the first glimpse of the fortress. It rose from the mountain like it had grown there. Black stone and iron, wide towers with no decorative flourish, walls thick enough to make a castle look humble by comparison. No banners, no welcome fires, just the structure itself, immovable and enormous, sitting at the edge of a cliff with the gray sky pressing down on it like a hand. Rose exhaled slowly. You are the only one who can fix this. She was not brave. She had never claimed to be. But she had always been the one who stayed when everyone else left, who cleaned what others broke, who apologized for disasters she had not caused. It was a particular kind of strength that looked nothing like strength from the outside. She straightened her back against the seat. The gates opened before the carriage stopped. The great hall of Ashenmore Keep was lit by iron chandeliers holding dozens of candles, and even so, it felt dark. The stone walls absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. The floor was pale gray granite, smooth and cold, and Rose's boots made soft sounds against it that seemed too loud in the silence. There were wolves in this room. She knew it without being told. She could feel it, a pressure in the air, a stillness that was not the stillness of empty space, but of things waiting, of power held deliberately in check. She had been escorted by 2 guards who had not spoken a single word to her. They stood now at her flanks, equally silent, and Rose kept her chin level and her hands folded in front of her, and tried very hard not to look as terrified as she was. At the far end of the hall, elevated on a dais of dark stone, was a throne, and on it sat the Lycan king. Rose had heard descriptions. Everyone had. Dominic of Ashenmore, called the Iron Lord in the south, the Unbroken in the north. 7 years on the throne. Never defeated in challenge. The man who had ended the border wars through 3 consecutive victories in single combat, each one against a challenger twice his size. She had imagined something monstrous. What she had not imagined was stillness. He was very still. Seated with the ease of someone who had never needed to perform authority because authority simply lived in him. Settled into the line of his shoulders and the angle of his jaw, and the dark eyes that were already watching her before she had taken 3 steps into the room. dark hair, longer than she expected, pushed back from a face that was... She searched for the right word, and landed reluctantly on severe. Not ugly. Not cruel. Severe. As though every unnecessary thing had been removed from it over years of cold and battle, leaving only what remained when softness was gone. He was watching her the way one watches something unexpected. Rose stopped at the base of the dais and inclined her head. "My Lord King." Her voice was steadier than she felt. "I am Rose Vance, second daughter of Lord Edmund of the Southern Reaches. I have come in response to your formal summons." Silence. She made herself look up. His eyes were darker than she had expected, almost black in the candlelight, and they moved over her face with the same quality as everything else about him. Deliberate. Unhurried. Like a man accustomed to reading things that tried to hide from him. "Second daughter," he said. His voice was low and even, like the sound before a storm. "Yes, my lord. I summoned the first." Rose held his gaze. "I know." Another silence. Longer. Somewhere in the shadows along the walls, she sensed movement. Other wolves, courtiers or guards, watching. "Then you know," Dominic said, "what it means that you are here instead." "I know what my sister did." She kept her voice quiet, not apologetic. She had decided, somewhere between the second and third day in the carriage, that she would not arrive groveling. Groveling had never helped her before. "And I know what the insult to your court requires. My family has sent me to offer what restitution they can." His expression did not change. "And what restitution does your family believe they can offer?" Rose breathed in through her nose. The hall smelled of wood smoke and pine resin and something older beneath both, stone that had absorbed centuries of cold. She thought of her father's study, the way he had not looked at her. "I don't know what my father believes," she said honestly, "but I know what I am willing to offer. My presence, my service, and whatever terms your court considers appropriate. I will not insult you by pretending my family's behavior was anything other than what it was." For the first time, something moved in his face. Not quite a reaction. More like the absence of a reaction where one had almost formed. He rose from the throne. He was taller than she had registered from across the room, broader. He descended the dais steps without hurry, and stopped at a distance close enough that she had to resist the urge to step back. "Your name is Rose," he said. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something she had not expected in any version of this meeting she had rehearsed. "Stay here tonight. You will not be harmed." He turned away from her and spoke to one of the guards. "Give her the east room, the warm one." Rose stood very still. "My lord, the terms of restitution." "Tomorrow," he said, without turning back. He walked out of the hall through a side door, and the darkness seemed to close behind him like water. Rose stood alone at the base of the empty throne and realized her hands had finally stopped shaking. Not from relief, but from something she could not yet name. Behind her, from the shadows near the far wall, she heard a low voice. Female, sharp, and distinctly unfriendly. "You should have stayed home, Vance girl." Rose turned. A woman stood near the eastern wall, tall, copper-skinned, with the kind of controlled stillness that marked every wolf she had seen in this room. Her dark eyes moved over Rose with open assessment and something close to contempt. "The king doesn't do charity," the woman continued. "Whatever he just offered you, it isn't kindness." Rose held her gaze steadily. "I didn't come here expecting kindness." The woman's eyes narrowed, and for just a moment, something flickered there that was not quite contempt. More like surprise, quickly buried. She said nothing else. She simply walked away. Rose turned back toward the empty throne and the cold stone hall, and for the first time since the carriage, she felt something settle in her chest. Not safety, not comfort, clarity. She was here. She was still standing. And whatever happened next, it would not find her on her knees. The east room was warm. That was the first thing Rose noticed when the guard opened the door and stepped aside without ceremony. A fire had already been lit in the wide stone hearth, and the wood was good, dry oak that burned clean and steady, throwing amber light across the walls. There was a bed with heavy wool blankets, a wash basin with water that still held faint traces of heat, and a narrow window that looked out over the mountain forest far below. Rose stood in the doorway for a moment before entering. She'd expected a storage room, a servant's cell, the kind of space that communicated, without words, exactly what a family thought you were worth. She set her bag down on the wooden chest at the foot of the bed and sat beside it, pressing her palms flat against the rough wool of the blanket. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving through the pine canopy with a sound like distant water. She did not sleep for a long time. Morning arrived gray and cold, the sky outside her window the color of old iron. Rose dressed carefully, her warmest dress, deep burgundy wool with long sleeves and a high collar, the kind of garment made for function rather than impression. She braided her brown hair back from her face, laced her boots, and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. Whatever he just offered you, it isn't kindness. The woman from last night. Rose had turned her words over through the long dark hours, examining them the way one examines a stone that might be a weapon. The warning had been real. She believed that. But real warnings could come from real concern, or from something else entirely. She would be careful. She was always careful. A knock at the door brought a young servant girl with a tray. Dark bread, hard cheese, dried fruit, a cup of something hot that smelled of bark and cloves. The girl set it down without speaking and moved to leave. "What is your name?" Rose asked. The girl paused, clearly surprised. "Marin, my lady." "Thank you, Marin." Another pause. Then the girl ducked her head quickly, almost a bow, and slipped out. Rose ate slowly, watching the fire die down to coals. She was taken to the king's council chamber an hour later. It was a different kind of room than the great hall. Smaller, practical, dominated by a long table of dark wood covered in maps and sealed documents. Candles burned in iron holders along the walls. The smell of ink and tallow hung in the air, mixed with pine smoke from a second hearth behind the table. Dominic was already there when she entered, standing at the far end of the table with his back partly to her, studying a map. He was dressed simply for a king, dark leather over a plain wool shirt, no crown, no formal adornment. Two other figures were present. A broad-shouldered older man with gray threading through his dark beard, seated at the table with a cup in his hand, and the woman from last night, standing near the window with her arms crossed. Rose entered and stood straight. Dominic turned. His eyes moved over her once, quickly, with that same quality of attention she had noticed in the hall, thorough without being intrusive. "You slept," he said. "Eventually," she answered honestly. Something shifted faintly at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. The ghost of one, perhaps, in another man. "Sit." He gestured to the chair across the table. "We will discuss terms." Rose sat. The older man across from her watched her with open curiosity rather than hostility, which she found slightly easier to manage. The woman at the window had not moved, had not looked away from Rose since she entered. Dominic took his seat at the head of the table. "Your family's alliance was considered significant," he said, setting both hands flat on the map in front of him. "The southern reaches control 3 trade passes. My territory depends on those passes remaining open through winter. Your sister's withdrawal endangered that arrangement." Rose nodded. "I understand." "What I require," he continued, "is not an apology. Apologies close no passes and fill no supply lines." His eyes were steady on hers. "What I require is a binding replacement for the agreement that was broken." The room was very quiet. Rose kept her voice even. "What form of binding did you have in mind?" It was the older man who spoke, not Dominic. His voice was rough and not unkind. The alliance was always meant to be sealed by marriage, girl. That was the structure of it. A Vance daughter, joined to this court. Not for sentiment, for stability. For the wolves of this territory and the humans of the South to have a shared interest in each other's survival. Rose looked at Dominic. He looked back at her without expression. "You are proposing," she said carefully, "that the arrangement stand, with me in my sister's place. I am proposing," Dominic said, "that you consider it. You are not your sister. I will not pretend otherwise, and I will not demand you pretend otherwise. What I am asking is whether you are willing to enter this arrangement with open eyes, knowing what it is and what it is not. Knowing what it is and what it is not." Rose turned that phrase over carefully. "What is it?" she asked. "A contract," he said, "with terms, protection for you within these walls. Your family's passes remain open and remain protected from the northern clans who have been watching them with interest since the withdrawal became known." He paused. "And your sister's scandal buried. My court will release a formal account. The alliance was always intended to be with the second daughter. That will become the truth the South believes." Rose's throat tightened. She thought of Cecilia. Foolish, selfish, luminous Cecilia, running off with her merchant's son, leaving behind a disaster she would never have to clean up herself. Of course she wouldn't. "And what is it not?" Rose asked quietly. Dominic was quiet for a moment. "It is not a performance. I have no interest in pretense or ceremony for its own sake. I have a territory to govern, and a court that requires stability. I am not asking for something I cannot define." He held her gaze. "I am asking if you are willing." The woman at the window made a short, sharp sound. Not quite a laugh. Rose glanced at her. The woman's jaw was tight, her dark eyes hard. Rose looked back at Dominic. "May I ask your advisor's name?" The woman at the window. The older man blinked. Dominic's expression did not change, but something in his stillness shifted slightly. "Sarah," he said. "My head of security." Rose turned to face Sarah directly. "You warned me last night. I took your warning seriously." She kept her voice calm, without accusation. "I'd rather have your honesty at this table than your silence near that window." Sarah stared at her. The hostility in her face was still present, but beneath it, something uncertain had appeared. The same flicker Rose had seen the night before. The older man cleared his throat. "I'm Brom. Before you ask." "Thank you, Brom." Rose turned back to Dominic. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't read entirely. Not calculating. Something more like attention. The kind that meant something had not gone the way he expected. Rose folded her hands on the table. Her heart was beating very fast, and she was grateful no one in this room could hear it, the way the wolves in the Great Hall probably could. "I have conditions," she said. Silence. "I will not be kept ignorant of what governs my own life. If there are threats to this territory that affect me, I am told." She held Dominic's gaze. "I will not be used as a symbol and left to be furniture in my own household. I will have purpose here beyond what my name provides." She paused. "And my sister is protected from whatever consequences this arrangement was meant to avoid. Whatever your court releases, it keeps her safe." And she had not planned that last part. It surprised her slightly as it came out. Dominic looked at her for a long moment. "You are negotiating for the sister who put you here," Brom said, not harshly. More like a man noting something remarkable. "She's still my sister," Rose said simply. The fire popped in the hearth behind her. The wind pressed against the narrow window where Sarah stood, and the pine trees far below moved like dark water. Dominic said, "Agreed." Rose exhaled slowly, evenly, through her nose. "Then we have terms," she said. Outside, Somewhere deep in the forest, something howled, long and low and ancient, rolling up the mountain like a warning or a welcome or both at once. Rose did not flinch, but she noticed that Sarah, across the room, was watching her with an expression that had finally, quietly, changed. The wedding took place 4 days later. There was no celebration. No flowers brought up from the south. No banquet tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats and honeyed wine. No musicians playing in torchlit corridors. Just a stone chapel at the eastern edge of the keep. An elder wolf who spoke the binding words in a language older than any Rose had studied, and 2 witnesses. Brahm, who stood with his hands folded and his expression solemn, and Sarah, who stood with her arms crossed and her jaw set like a woman attending something she had formally objected to, and formally lost. Rose wore her best dress. It was dark green wool, simple and well-made, with small pearl buttons at the wrists that had belonged to her mother. She had sewn them on herself, years ago, onto the only garment she had ever altered for beauty, rather than practicality. Dominic stood beside her in dark ceremonial leather, a clasp of hammered iron at his collar, and said the binding words in a voice that did not waver. When it was done, he looked at her, really looked for just a moment, and said quietly, so only she could hear, "You are safe here." Rose nodded once. She did not say "I know," because she didn't know. Not yet. But she filed those 3 words away carefully, in the place where she kept things that mattered, before she was certain they were true. The keep had a rhythm, and Rose learned it the way she learned most things, by watching, quietly, from the edges. Mornings began before dawn. The wolves of Ashenmoor were not creatures of leisure. Guards rotated at the walls in the gray pre-light. The kitchens fired before sunrise, filling the lower corridors with the smell of wood smoke and porridge and the sharp, clean scent of pine soap. Brahm held a brief council meeting each morning in the map room, attended by the pack's senior members, reviewing territory boundaries, supply counts, reports from the outer settlements. Rose was not invited to those meetings. Not at first. She spent her first week learning the keep's geography, its corridors and storerooms, its cold larders and its libraries, its chapel and its training yards. She spoke to Marin, who had begun to lose her wariness, and now occasionally offered information unprompted. She spoke to the kitchen staff, who were human, and therefore looked at her with the specific relief of people finding something familiar in an unfamiliar place. She did not speak much to Dominic. He was present. She was aware of him the way one is aware of a fire in a cold room, a peripheral warmth that changed the quality of the air. But they existed in the same space without yet existing in the same conversation. He ate at the head of the long hall table in the evenings, and she sat to his right, and they exchanged practical words about practical things, and she watched him from the corner of her eye and tried to understand what lived beneath the severity of his face. She had decided not to be afraid of him. That decision required maintenance, like a fire. She tended it daily. On the 6th morning, she found the library. It was on the 3rd floor of the North Tower, behind a door that looked like a wall panel until you noticed the hinges. Inside, shelves from floor to ceiling, crammed with volumes in 3 languages, rolled maps, bundled correspondence, handwritten journals with cracked leather spines. The smell hit her before anything else. Old paper, dust, and the particular dry sweetness of ink that had been drying for decades. Rose stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame and felt, for the first time since leaving home, something that was not anxiety. She went inside. She was deep in a survey of the northern mountain passes, a hand-drawn map with margin notes and a script she was beginning to decipher, when she heard the door open behind her. She turned. Dominic stood in the doorway. He was not in his formal leather today. A plain wool shirt, untucked, the kind of thing worn when no one is expected to observe you. He looked at her, then at the map in her hands, then at the shelf she had clearly been working through methodically. "You found it," he said. "I wasn't sure if I was meant to," she admitted. "You were." He stepped inside, moving to a shelf on the far wall with the ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times. I had it unlocked when I had the east room prepared. He pulled a volume down, checked its spine, replaced it. Most of the court doesn't come here. Rose looked back at the map. Why not? Most of the court reads only what is required of them. He said it without contempt, simply as fact. She ran her finger along a trade route marked in faded red ink. These margin notes. Is this your writing? A pause. My father's. She looked up. His back was to her, hand resting on the shelf. Something in the set of his shoulders had changed, a tightening so slight she might have imagined it. He surveyed the passes himself, Dominic said, before the border wars, when movement between territories was still. He stopped, then, simpler. Rose set the map down carefully. How old were you when the wars began? He turned to look at her. The question had been direct, and she saw him register that. Register that she had asked rather than waited to be told. 14, he said. She nodded, and did not push further, and went back to the map. After a moment, she heard him pull a chair from the corner and sit. Not near her, not far. They spent an hour in the library without speaking much, and it was the most comfortable Rose had felt since arriving. It was Brom who told her about Sarah. He found Rose in the training yard one afternoon. She had been watching the guards drill, not from fascination with the combat, but because she was trying to understand the keep's defensive structure, and settled beside her on the stone wall with a grunt that suggested his knees had opinions about stairs. She doesn't dislike you, he said without preamble. Rose looked at him. Sarah. She distrusts the situation. He squinted at the yard. There's a difference, though she'd deny it. Rose waited. She's been with Dominic since before the throne, Brom said. Raised in the same pack. She watched what this court cost him. The wars, the challenges, the politics. Every alliance attempted and broken. He paused. Your sister was not the first. There have been other arrangements, other withdrawals, other insults. Rose absorbed this. She expected the same from me. She still half expects it. He glanced at her sideways. But you asked her name in council, and looked her in the eye when you did it, and that is apparently not what she expected from a Southern lord's daughter. I wasn't trying to impress her. No, Brom said, with what sounded like approval. That's why it worked. A commotion at the far end of the yard drew both their gazes. Two of the younger wolves were sparring, moving too fast for Rose to follow cleanly, a blur of controlled force. And Sarah had stepped in, stopping one of them with a hand on his collar, correcting his stance in sharp, efficient gestures. Rose watched her. The competence was undeniable. The care beneath the sharpness was, once you knew to look, equally undeniable. What is she afraid of? Rose asked quietly. Brom was quiet for a moment. That he'll let himself trust something that leaves, he said finally. He rebuilt everything after the wars. The pack, the court, the alliances, piece by piece. He paused. A man can rebuild a great deal and still carry the original damage. Rose thought of Dominic in the library, his father's handwriting on old maps. That evening at dinner, she looked down the long table at him, and he happened to look up at the same moment, and she did not look away first. Neither did he. Later, passing through the corridor toward the North Tower, she heard Marin's voice, high, frightened, coming from behind the door of the lower storeroom. Rose opened it without thinking. Inside, Marin, backed against a shelf of grain sacks, her face pale. And a man Rose didn't recognize. Broad, wolf, eyes carrying an edge of something that did not belong in a keep that was meant to be orderly, standing too close to her, speaking too softly. Rose stepped fully into the doorway. Marin, she said clearly, I need you in the east corridor. The man turned. His eyes moved over Rose with the specific assessment of someone calculating whether she was worth minding. Rose held his gaze and did not move from the doorway. A long moment passed. The man stepped back, slowly, with the deliberate casualness of someone pretending a retreat was a choice. He walked past Rose without touching her, close enough that she could smell leather and something sour beneath it, and was gone. Marin let out a shaking breath. Rose stepped inside and let the door close behind her. "Are you all right?" "Yes, my lady." The girl's voice was unsteady. He comes through sometimes. He's not supposed to be in this wing." "What is his name?" Marin hesitated. "Gareth, my lady. He has rank here. I don't know his exact—" "It's all right," Rose said. "You don't have to explain it." She looked at the girl steadily. "But if it happens again, you tell me." Marin stared at her, then nodded, quickly, with the wide eyes of someone unaccustomed to being told that what happened to them mattered. Rose left the storeroom and stood for a moment in the corridor, the cold stone wall at her back, and turned the name over in her mind. Gareth. She filed it alongside everything else she had been quietly collecting since she arrived. The shape of this place, its tensions and its loyalties, its old wounds and its present dangers. She was furniture to no one. And something in Ashenmore Keep, she was beginning to understand, was not what it appeared to be. The name Gareth appeared again 3 days later. Rose had not gone looking for it. She had simply been present, in the way she had always been present, quiet and observant and easy to overlook. When Brahm came into the map room with a sealed report and set it on the table in front of Dominic with an expression that carried weight. Rose was in the corner with a survey document, and neither man acknowledged her, which meant neither man remembered she was there. She had spent 23 years being forgotten in rooms. She knew how to be still. "The Eastern settlement is short again," Brahm said, tapping the report. "3rd month running. The supply count doesn't match what was dispatched from the keep." Dominic opened the seal and read. His face did not change, but the quality of his stillness shifted. That particular density she had learned to recognize as contained anger rather than indifference. Who managed the dispatch? Gareth's unit. A silence that had temperature. "Every time?" Dominic said. "Every time," Brahm confirmed. "I didn't want to bring it until I was certain." Rose kept her eyes on the survey document in her hands and breathed evenly. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall. The first true snow of the season, coming down in slow, heavy flakes that softened the edges of the pine trees and collected in the corners of the stone sills. "Keep it contained," Dominic said finally. "I want to know where it's going before I move." Brahm nodded and left. Dominic stood at the table for a moment. Then, without turning, "You heard that." Rose looked up. He was still facing the map, one hand resting on the edge of the table. "Yes," she said. "And you already knew the name." She hesitated only briefly. "I encountered him in the lower corridor 3 days ago. He was present with Marin in a way that wasn't appropriate. I removed myself and her from the situation." Now he turned. His eyes found hers across the room, and the quality of his attention was different from the controlled assessment of their early meetings. More direct, less managed. "You didn't tell me," he said. "I didn't know yet if it was connected to something larger," she said, "or if it was simply a man with poor judgment." She paused. "Now I know." He looked at her for a long moment. "You were collecting information." "I was being careful," she said. "There's a difference." Something moved through his expression, not quite surprise, something older and more complicated than surprise. Like a man recognizing something he had not expected to find. He pulled out the chair across from hers and sat down. "Tell me exactly what you saw," he said. She told him. Not just about Gareth and Marin, about everything she had been quietly noting since her arrival. The supply routes she had studied in the library, the defensive gaps she had observed from the training yard wall, the particular way the Eastern Corridor guards changed rotation slightly later than the others, which she had noticed because she was often awake before dawn and had taken to walking. She told him plainly, without embellishment, the way she had always processed the world, as information to be understood rather than drama to be performed. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You've been here less than 2 weeks," he said. "I pay attention," she said. "I always have. It was never useful at home." She looked down at the survey in her hands, then set it on the table. "I thought it might be useful here." The fire in the corner hearth shifted, throwing a brief warm light across the dark wood of the table. Outside, the snow was falling faster now, the pine forest below the window disappearing into white. "Gareth has rank in this court," Dominic said. "Old rank. His family line predates mine on this mountain." "Brom told me something of the history," Rose said carefully. "Then you know that removing him is not simple." He said it without apology, as a fact requiring no softening. A king who moves against old blood without sufficient cause risks fracturing the pack. Wolves do not follow a king who appears threatened by his own court. "He appears to be stealing from your eastern settlements," Rose said. "That seems like sufficient cause." "It will be," he said, "when I have the complete shape of it." His eyes held hers. "Which is why I need you to continue doing exactly what you have been doing." Rose considered this. "You want me to keep watching?" "I want you to tell me what you see," he said. "Not report to me. Tell me. As someone who moves through this, keep in ways I cannot. As someone people underestimate and therefore speak freely around." The word landed quietly between them. Underestimate. He had said it without cruelty and without pity, simply as an accurate description of a quality that had value. Rose had heard that word applied to her entire life as a wound. Hearing it offered as a tool felt strange in a way she did not entirely know how to hold. "All right," she said. He nodded once and reached for the supply report, and they sat in the same room with the snow falling outside and worked through the documents together until the candles burned low. It was Sarah who came to her room that night. Rose answered the knock to find the wolf woman in the doorway, no longer in her security post leather but in a plain dark tunic, her copper-dark hair loose around her shoulders. She looked, for the first time, like a person rather than a position. She also looked like someone who had argued with herself for some time before knocking. "May I come in?" Sarah asked. Rose stepped back from the door. Sarah entered and stood near the fireplace, looking at the flames rather than at Rose. A long moment passed. "I owe you something," Sarah said finally. Not an apology, an explanation. "You don't owe me anything," Rose said. "Yes," Sarah said, with a clipped firmness. "I do. Because I was rude to you when you arrived and you hadn't yet done anything to deserve it. And that was about me, not you." She paused. "So I'm explaining." Rose sat on the edge of the bed and waited. Sarah was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire, the amber light moving across her face. "The last woman brought to this court as an alliance arrangement was 3 years ago," she said. "She was kind enough, smiled a great deal, seemed content." She paused. She was feeding information to a rival clan, for 8 months, before we found out. Rose was still. "Dominic handled it quietly," Sarah continued. "He always handles things quietly, but I watched what it cost him, not the political damage that he managed. The other thing." She finally turned to look at Rose. He trusted her, in small ways, careful ways, the only ways he trusts, and she used it. Rose understood now, fully. "So when I arrived," Rose said, "I was already guilty of what she had done." "In my mind," Sarah said, without softening it, "yes." "And now?" Sarah looked at her steadily. "Now I'm in your room at night, telling you something I haven't told anyone since it happened." She said it bluntly, like a woman who had not intended to arrive at this point and was mildly irritated to find herself here. So interpret that as you like. Rose looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "What was her name?" Sarah blinked, clearly not the response she expected. "Nadia," she said after a pause. "I'm not Nadia," Rose said simply. "No," Sarah said. "You're not." She looked at the fire again. "You're also the first person in this keep who's asked me something about myself rather than about him." A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. Something more like the silence after a tension releases, when the air adjusts to the new space. "Gareth," Rose said. "How long has he been a problem?" Sarah's jaw tightened. "Long enough. He was Dominic's father's man first. Stayed on, never directly challengeable, always just within the edges of what's permissible." She glanced at Rose sharply. "You know about the supplies. I was in the map room." Sarah made a short sound that was almost, nearly, something like a laugh. "Of course you were." "He has allies here," Rose said. It was not a question. Sarah's expression darkened. "3 that I've identified. Possibly more." She paused. "He's been building something slowly. The kind of slow that's meant not to be noticed." Rose thought of Marin in the storeroom, backed against the grain sacks. She thought of the supply reports. She thought of Dominic saying, "I need to know where it's going before I move." "He knows the king is watching him," Rose said. "He suspects," Sarah said. "Which means he'll move before Dominic has everything he needs to act." The fire cracked and settled. Snow pressed against the window in soft, insistent curtains. "Then we need to move first," Rose said quietly. Sarah looked at her for a long, measuring moment. The wariness was still there. It might always be there, Rose thought, and that was fine. Wariness in the right person was not an obstacle. It was a resource. "You know," Sarah said slowly, "when Brom told me you'd negotiated your own terms in council without blinking, I thought he was exaggerating." "He wasn't," Rose said. "No," Sarah said. "He wasn't." She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the frame, and looked back at Rose with an expression that had, finally and completely, shed its original shape. "Get some sleep," she said. "Tomorrow will require thinking." She left. Rose sat alone by the dying fire, her hands folded in her lap, listening to the snow against the glass. Somewhere below, in the deep corridors of the keep, she heard footsteps that moved with the particular weight and rhythm she had already, without meaning to, learned to recognize. Dominic, walking his nightly round of the walls. She had not meant to learn that about him. She found quietly that she was glad she had. The trap was Sarah's idea. The timing was Rose's. They worked it out over 2 mornings in the library, speaking quietly over maps and supply ledgers, while snow continued to fall outside, and the keep moved around them in its usual rhythms. Dominic knew the shape of it. He had listened to both of them present the plan in the map room with his hands flat on the table and his expression unreadable, and when they finished, he had looked at Rose for a moment longer than he looked at Sarah and said, "Do it." The plan was simple because the best ones always were. A false dispatch record, supplies routed to the western settlement rather than the eastern, logged in the official ledger by Brom's hand, announced at the morning council in front of every senior pack member, including Gareth's 2 confirmed allies. The kind of information that would travel fast through compromised channels. The kind of opportunity that a man who had been operating carefully for years would find difficult to resist. Rose's contribution was the timing. She had spent 3 weeks learning the keep's rhythm, and she knew, from her pre-dawn walks, from Marin's careful observations, from the pattern of the Eastern Corridor Guard rotation, exactly when Gareth's movements through the keep went unmonitored. A window of approximately 40 minutes, just before the second bell of morning. She had not meant to become useful in this way. She had not arrived at Ashenmoor intending to dismantle anyone. But she had arrived intending to have purpose, and purpose, she was learning, looked like whatever the situation required. The night it happened, Rose did not sleep. She sat in the library with a candle and a book she was not reading, listening to the keep settle around her, the wind off the mountain pressing against the shutters, the distant sound of the night guard's boots on the outer wall, the deep structural groans of old stone adjusting to cold. The door opened and Dominic came in. He was dressed for movement, dark leather, boots, no formal adornment. He looked at her sitting at the reading table with her unread book and said nothing about it. He sat in the chair across from her. "Sarah is in position," he said. "I know." She had passed Sarah in the corridor an hour ago, exchanged a single nod. Silence. The candle flame moved in a draft. "You should not have put yourself in Gareth's path in the storeroom," he said. His voice was even. The evenness cost something, she could tell. "If he had..." "He didn't," she said. "Rose." She looked at him steadily. He was looking back at her with that quality of attention that she had stopped finding unsettling and started finding something else. Something she was still learning the name of. "I know," she said more quietly. "I know it was a risk. I didn't calculate it that way in the moment. Marin was frightened." She paused. "I don't do well with frightened people being left alone." He was quiet for a moment. "Neither do I," he said. "I simply have more resources with which to address it." "You weren't there," she said simply. "I was." He looked at her across the table in the candlelight, and something in his face did what it rarely did. It moved. Not dramatically. Not in the way of a man unraveling. Just... The severity shifted, slightly, like a shutter opening by 1 degree to let in a single line of light. "My father believed," he said slowly, "that a king who showed what mattered to him gave his enemies a map. He said it the way people say things they have carried for a long time, worn smooth from handling. He governed from that principle for 30 years. Rose waited. "He also died alone," Dominic said, "with no one in the room who had ever known him as anything other than the king." The fire cracked. Rose did not say anything, because nothing needed to be said. She understood what he was telling her, and she understood that the telling of it was itself the thing. The small, careful opening of a door that had been shut for a very long time. She reached across the table and set her hand over his. He looked down at it. Then he turned his hand beneath hers, slowly, and held it. They sat that way in silence until the second bell rang through the keep, and then both of them stood. It happened fast, the way these things always do when the preparation has been thorough. Gareth was in the western storage corridor at the 40-minute window, exactly as predicted, with 2 of his allies and a third man Rose didn't recognize. 4 of them, moving to intercept the false supply route. Sarah was waiting with 6 of her most trusted wolves. Brom had secured the outer gate. Rose was not there. She had agreed to that. Not because anyone had told her to stay back, but because she had looked at the tactical layout and understood that her presence in that corridor would be a liability. And she was not a woman who let pride override sense. She waited in the map room. She heard it, not the details, but the shape of it. Raised voices, a brief, contained violence, the sound of it reaching her as vibration through the stone walls more than actual noise. Then silence, then boots in the corridor. Sarah opened the map room door. There was a cut on her forearm, already clotting, that she did not appear to have noticed. "Done," she said. Rose exhaled. "Gareth?" "In custody. His allies, too." Sarah's jaw was tight, but her eyes were clear. "The third man, the one we didn't know, he tried to run. Didn't get far." She paused. "He was carrying written orders, not from Gareth." Rose went very still. "From whom?" Sarah looked at her. "A name from the eastern clans, one we've suspected of watching the passes." She paused. The supply theft wasn't just Gareth lining his pockets. It was deliberate destabilization. Weaken the eastern settlements, create resentment in the pack toward Dominic's leadership, fracture the court from inside before moving on the passes. The trade passes, the ones that had made this alliance necessary in the first place. Rose sat down in the nearest chair and pressed her fingers to her mouth for a moment, thinking. The southern passes, she said. My family's territory. Would have been the next pressure point, Sarah confirmed. Yes. Rose thought of her father's study, the bags packed before she agreed. The alliance her family had built, and then shattered through Cecilia's impulsive flight, and how that fracture had been, apparently, watched with interest by people who understood exactly what it meant for the northern supply lines. She thought of herself in that carriage, smelling of fear, believing she was traveling toward a punishment. Rose, Sarah said. Her voice had lost its edge entirely, which was how Rose knew it was serious. You should hear this from me before Dominic tells you formally. She paused. The written orders reference the original alliance arrangement. They reference its breakdown. She met Rose's eyes steadily. Whoever engineered this, we don't yet know how much of what happened with your sister was natural, and how much was encouraged from outside. The room was very quiet. Rose absorbed this slowly, carefully, the way she absorbed everything, letting it settle into its true shape, rather than reacting to its first impression. Cecilia, who had run, the merchant's son, who had appeared at precisely the right moment in the months before the ceremony. You're saying Cecilia may have been used, Rose said. I'm saying it's possible, Sarah said carefully. We don't know yet. Dominic is looking into it. Rose stood. I want to be part of that investigation. Sarah looked at her for a moment, then nodded without argument, which was its own kind of answer about how far they had traveled from that first night in the Great Hall. Epilogue. What remains spring came to Ashenmoor the way it came to all mountain places, reluctantly, in stages, the snow retreating inch by inch while the pines held their cold green, and the stone walls slowly released the winter they had stored in their bones. Rose noticed it first in the smell of the morning air. A softening. Something alive beneath the cold that had not been there before. She stood at the window of the library, her library now, in the way that places become yours when you have spent enough hours inside them, and watched the first pale light move across the mountain below, turning the remaining snow gold at its edges. The investigation had taken 2 months. It had confirmed what Sarah suspected. The merchant's son who had swept Cecilia away had not been the impulsive romantic he appeared. He had been encouraged, funded, pointed in the right direction by agents of the Eastern clan leader, whose name Rose now knew well, a man called Voss, who had spent years constructing the conditions for a war he intended to win before it was formally declared. Cecilia had not known. She had been genuinely enchanted, genuinely swept away, which was so entirely like Cecilia that Rose had found herself grieving for her sister in a new way. Not for what she had done, but for what had been done to her through her own brightest quality. Her capacity for feeling had been turned into a tool by people who had none. Voss had been brought before a council of 5 clan leaders and stripped of his eastern holdings. It had not been Dominic's decision alone. He had built the case carefully, presented it through proper channels, moved with the deliberate patience of a man who understood that lasting justice required structures stronger than individual force. Rose had sat beside him in that council, not as a symbol, as the person who had helped build the case. Cecilia was in the southern reaches with her merchant, who had, when confronted with the truth of what he had unknowingly participated in, broken down entirely and cooperated with every inquiry. He was not a bad man. He was a weak one, which was different. Rose had written to her sister once, a careful letter that neither accused nor absolved, but simply opened a door. She had not yet received an answer. She thought she might, eventually. Gareth was gone from Ashenmoor, exiled, which in wolf terms carried consequences she understood better now than she had in the beginning. His allies had faced their own reckonings. The eastern settlements had received 3 months of supplemented supplies and a formal acknowledgement from Dominic himself, delivered in person, which Brom told her quietly was something the king had never done before, and which had meant more to those settlements than any material restitution. Maren had been given a different position in the keep, one that kept her from the lower corridors. She had also, in the past month, begun to smile in the way people smile when they have remembered they are allowed to. Rose heard the door open behind her. She knew his footsteps without turning. She had known them for months now, known the weight and rhythm of them, the particular way they paused at the threshold of a room she was in. Not hesitation, she had come to understand, but something more deliberate than that. A choice, made each time, to enter rather than pass by. Dominic came to stand beside her at the window. He was holding 2 cups of the bark and clove drink that the kitchen made in the mornings, and he held one out to her without speaking. She took it. Their fingers touched briefly at the transfer, and neither of them moved away from it. They stood at the window together and watched the spring light move across the mountain. Brom wants to expand the Eastern Settlement Charter, he said. I know. I read the proposal. She wrapped both hands around the warm cup. It's good. The water access provision especially. He said you suggested that part. He did most of the work. He said you suggested that part, Dominic repeated, with the particular quality in his voice that she had learned was as close as he came to gentle teasing. She smiled at the window. Silence. The comfortable kind. The kind that had taken months to build from the rubble of everything uncertain and provisional, and afraid that had preceded it. I want to ride to the Eastern settlements with you, she said, when you go for the charter signing. I know, he said. I was going to ask you. She looked at him. He was looking at the mountain, the pale spring light across the hard lines of his face, and she thought of what Brom had told her months ago. A man can rebuild a great deal and still carry the original damage. And she thought of what she knew now, that rebuilding did not mean the damage disappeared, but that it became part of the structure, rather than a wound in it, that the places that had broken could become, if tended, the strongest places of all. She had come here as a replacement for her sister, as an apology wearing a person's shape. As a girl her father had packed away into a carriage before she had agreed to go, because she had always been the one who stayed when everyone else left. She was still the one who stayed. But it was hers now, the staying. Chosen and clear-eyed and entirely her own. Dominic turned from the window and looked at her, and in his dark eyes, in the quiet of the library that smelled of old paper and pine smoke and morning, she saw what had been building for months. Not performed, not sudden, not anything that required a word to make it true. It had simply become true, the way the spring had come. Gradually, in stages, until one morning the cold was just gone, and what remained was this. He reached over and tucked a strand of her brown hair back from her face, and his hand rested briefly at her jaw, and she leaned into it without thinking, which was how she knew. Outside, somewhere on the mountain below, the first birds of spring were beginning. The library was warm. Rose was home.